We are here today at El Colegio de México, leading institute of social science and humanities studies in this country, Mexico. And we are here to talk about a new book published by a professor, Professor Ishita Banerjee-Dube. It's A History of Modern India, published by Cambridge University Press. This is a major work. It will become inevitably a standard work for courses and for anybody interested in the history of modern India. So I'm very pleased to have here Professor Ishita. And I will begin asking her a question, which is, what do you consider to be modern India in relation to this book?
First, let me thank you for the invitation and for giving me this chance to speak about the book in Mexico and in Latin America, hopefully for a public in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. The question of modern India can be understood in two ways. The first one is apparently simple, that of chronology. But implicit in it is also a questioning of the periodization of history. And the second related question, therefore, has a greater normative baggage. When and how did India become modern? Or did it become modern at all? Right? So in the book, I try to take both these senses, in my discussion of the modern. So chronologically, all courses on South Asia, modern South Asia, all over the world, start from the 18th century and go on till the 20th. Some of them end with India's independence in 1947. Others, especially universities in India, have extended it to include independent India as well. So the book, therefore, does cover the period between the 18th and the 20th centuries. At the same time, it brings in a discussion of the notion of the early modern, where early modernity begins much before the 18th century, from the 16th, where we are speaking of a globalized Indian Ocean world. We are speaking of notions of universal empires, the connections between the Mughals and the Safavids and the Ottomans. So from the very first chapter, I bring in this notion of the early modern to put a question mark on our ideas of India becoming modern with the arrival of the British. That is, meaning coming under one central administration of a consciously modern state, which at the same time is colonial.
But you continue. Modern India begins in this period of early modern and then modern. Mm-hmm. But you continue to the present day in the book.
Yes, I mean, except for this short, brief discussion on the early modern, it begins in the 18th century, which is again meant to be a remarkable century for India and for Asian societies in general, because the debate on the 18th century posits it as the intervention of industrialized European nations into dynamic but agricultural Asian societies. And for India in particular, the 18th century is viewed as an interlude between two empires, the downfall of the Mughal and the emergence of the British, which is not strictly true, because in India it's the East India Company that is ruling till 1857, the middle of the 19th century.
But afterwards, India becomes a British colony formally, no?
Yes, from 1858.
And for 100 years almost,
yes,
it is a colony and reached its independence in 1947. Mm-hmm. Now, how does this book narrate that story, the history of modern India, and what are more specifically its implications for perceptions of the colony and the nation in Mexico and Latin America?
The book is influenced by the hermeneutic tradition of history, which means it gives greater emphasis to an interpretive analysis of facts rather than a somewhat superficial focus on just objective facts per se. This means that the book attempts to offer an open-ended narrative where a plurality of pasts come to the fore. And plurality and heterogeneity. It doesn't mean that there's been, the story can be told only in one way. So there are multiple tales, but there are also lateral tales. And the idea is to narrate the history without a closure. So in this sense, the book tries to portray, the colony and the nation not as, self-contained entities. It tries to show how both the idea of the nation and the colony emerges and evolves through several socio-historical, economic, political processes. And it also shows how the concept of the nation and nationalism, it's highly contested. So in that sense, I think it has great implications for understandings of the colony and the nation in Mexico and in Latin America, although we are speaking of two very different kind of colonialisms. One is what we know as very early colonialism, and something that I haven't really looked into, but I would like to look into. It's a colonialism that begins prior to the Enlightenment. And for India, as you know, it's a question of, it's a case of very late colonialism, and it's a country, state that's consciously modern. So its imperatives for governing India are also quite different. So I think, but the notion of the colony and the nation, or the imperium and the nation, that they can be both contested and that they are not one and different, I think it has implications. And as I said, the other thing that it tries to do is also look at people who did not relate to the idea of the nation. So one, it tries to project events and processes from the perspective of different groups and peoples. So the same events and processes therefore take on different dimensions. So that's what I mean by the plurality and heterogeneity of events and processes in the past.
Well, the book is a history of modern India, a political history, a social history, an economic history, and a cultural history, and also focuses heavily on gender. Now, what does the perspective of gender contribute to our understanding of history and of modern India? How does it help improve it?
Well, I go by Joan Scott's classic analysis of gender, in her 1986 article, where she says that gender should be looked at as a constitutive element of social relations based on the perceived differences between the sexes. And second, and that for me is more important, gender as a primary way of signifying relations of power. So if we keep that perspective in mind from the beginning, gender opens up new dimensions for the understanding of, let's say, even political history, because traditionally the idea was that, gender initially was associated with women, and they were, played important roles in the family, but in the private life of the nation, and therefore not that important for political, for high politics, let's say. But that's precisely the point. If we look at the cultural discourse of nationalism from the perspective of gender, we come to realize the centrality, the male discourse accorded to the reconstituted new modern Indian woman as the cultural marker of difference from the West. And this I've looked at it very briefly and very sketchily. I think it also happens in Mexico. So the nation and nationalism, to pick up the two major concepts that this book deals with, would look completely different. So in that sense, it is about opening, reflecting, and questioning the terms of history and historiography, history writing, by doing it from the perspective of gender.
Well, this conversation raises many very interesting issues that reflect the way that Professor Ishita Banerjee-Dube has written the history of modern India. In other words, it's doing it from an interpretive point of view and raising questions. So we would recommend you highly to read this book, A History of Modern India, published by Cambridge this year. And we thank you very much.
Thank you.